Chapter 5, Part 2, Allocating Costs Based on Equivalent Units and Journal Entries. So now we're going to go through the 5-step process. Now remember, process costing, again, I love this analogy, is like a snowball rolling down a hill. The product, a batch of the product, runs through each department, and as it goes through each department, we're going to add materials, direct labor, and overhead. So now we're going to go through our 5-step process. So first, what we're going to do, we did this in part 1. We're going to summarize the flow of the physical units and compute output in terms of equivalent units. We always have to do that. Then we're going to summarize the total cost to account for, and then we're going to compute the cost per equivalent unit. And then the last thing we're going to do is allocate that cost based on equivalent units, cost per equivalent unit, to completed units and transferred out and ending work in process. So now let's take a look at another example. Okay, what we have here is an example, and we're going to go through step 1. And here we have beginning work in process and units, units started, ending units. We have the costs associated with beginning work in process, and here we have direct materials, remember, and conversion costs. What are conversion costs? Direct labor and overhead. Then we're going to add more material and add conversion costs. Now, in this example, we're assuming all materials are added at the beginning of the process. Remember, always check for that, because what that means is that materials are going to be 100% not only for the units that are transferred out, but also for the ones in ending inventory. So now we're going to do our step 1, and we're going to first summarize the flow of the physical units. We began with 100. We added 1,000,005, so we have to account for 1,000,006. So now we're going to look at determining the equivalent units. This is what we did in part 1. What we're going to do is we know we have ending, and now based on our item 1, we know that we have a total that we have account for of 1,000,006, and that tells us the number that were completed and transferred out, which is what we need to determine equivalent units on, is 1.4 million. Now we also know that these are always going to be at 100% because they're complete. Now, since direct materials are added at the beginning of the process, the materials are 100% even for the ending WIP. And we also know, though, that as to conversion costs, it's 20%, and so we get 80,000 there. Now we can figure out our total equivalent units. Now we can move on to the rest of the steps. First, we're going to summarize our total cost to account for. We have our beginning WIP. We have our costs added to WIP during the month, and that tells us we have to allocate $2,432,000 between goods transferred to the finished goods transferred to the next process, if there is another process, or to finished goods if there isn't, but there usually is, and ending WIP in this first department. So now we know that these are equivalent units, and we're going to divide that into the costs associated with direct materials and conversion costs, and we have a rate. We know that for direct materials, it's going to be $1.15 per equivalent unit, and for conversion costs, it's going to be 40 cents per equivalent unit. Now we can allocate the costs. First, completed and transferred out tells us we're going to take that times the equivalent unit rate, and that tells us the total amount we're going to allocate to the next process, or department 2, or to finished goods if that's the last process. Ending work in process. We're going to take that times the 200 and the 80. This is usually where people mess up. They forget that they have to use the partial units. And now that's the cost assigned. Now this is a good check because we know that that has to equal 2,432,000, which it does. Now let's take a look at our journals. Here's what our T account looks like. And the first thing we want to do is book our raw materials, our wages payable, and our overhead. And that is going to go to Department 1. We're assuming there's more departments, and that would be added to our work in process for Department 1. Next, we've completed 1,000,004. So now we're going to reduce Department 1, and if there's another apartment, it's going to Department 2. And if you notice, that's the same total we were talking about. We get the 262. Now let's look at one more problem, and this is just presented differently, but it's like your homework, so I wanted to make sure you understood it. Here's what we have. We have a T account that shows you the beginning balance. We don't know how much was transferred to finishing. We don't know what the ending inventory was, but we do know how much was added. We had a beginning balance, we added direct materials, and we added conversion costs. So other information, we had beginning inventory, 10,150 unfinished units. We started another 71,050. We had ending works in process of 8,200 units that were 60% complete for direct materials, which means that direct materials are added during the process, and 20% for conversion work. The beginning balance and working process consisted of 25,500 for conversion for material and 46,930 for conversion costs. Now we have everything we need to work the problem. So first we're going to start with our beginning WIP plus units started during the month gives us the total we have to account for. Now we compute our equivalent units. We know what the ending WIP was. We know what the total physical units accounted for was. So now we know how many were completed and transferred out, which is always going to be our total minus ending WIP. Now these are units. Now we know that completed and transferred out are 100%. We know that our ending was partial for direct material, 60%, and for conversion, only 20%. Now we add those up, and now we have our equivalent units. So now we can go to our next step, which is to look at our cost, and to look at our cost, a total cost, and then come up with an amount per equivalent unit, and then we can allocate our cost between transferred out and ending WIP. So we're going to summarize our total cost. Our beginning WIP plus costs added during the month gives us our total cost. Now we know that 404,776 is the total that has to be allocated between transferred out and ending inventory. If you don't get that total, you've done something wrong. Now we're going to determine the cost per equivalent unit, which means we're going to divide the direct material and conversion cost total by the equivalent units that we calculated in part 2. And that gives us a cost of $2.80 for materials and $2.50 for conversion costs. Now we can assign the costs. Completed and transferred out always gets 100%. And that gives us a total of 386,900. And now we can do it for ending work in process, which gives us 17,876, and that gives us our total of 404,776. And the last thing we're going to do is our journal. And we're going to add it to the next department and take it out of our one that we just finished. And that concludes part 2. I hope that this should help you with the homework because it's just like your homework problems.